I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those who don't know, that means may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Today we're going to be talking about the failed hypothesis, has science killed religion? And I'm going to talk about two main things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is, does science lead to atheism? Because we hear about this quite a bit, especially in the online sphere. Also, we're going to be talking about, well, has science led to the denial of religion, the denial of revelation? So I want to address these two key topics. I think it's very important for us to understand that there is a distinction between what the academics say and what happens on Google. Okay, I think that's very important for us to understand this, because the very fact that we have to give such a lecture or a talk is a symptom of a cause. It's a symptom of a problem, and the problem is that there is a bit of a gap, especially in Western society, especially in Britain, between what's happening in academia and what's happening in popular culture. Yes, there are overlaps, sometimes there's some kind of link, but generally speaking, there is a gap amongst certain groups of people. And this is why I think the British government had to basically come up with the project called Impact, which was to make an impact. The professors and the academics had to basically, engage in popular culture discourse to bridge that gap. And to do so, they would make an impact, right? So this is one of the reasons why I think the British government did that. So I want you to really understand that this question really is not much of a question when it comes to academic discourse, because professors and academics, especially when it comes to the first point that I mentioned earlier, does science lead to atheism? They would say, even if they're atheists, they would say, no, it doesn't. And we have to be very honest. It just doesn't. Simple as that. And I'm going to try and explain why that's the case. So let's start with the first thing that we want to speak about, which is, does science lead to atheism? Does science lead to the denial of God? Well, this is a false assertion. And the reason it's a false assertion is based on four false assumptions, okay? The first assumption is, science is the only yardstick for truth, right? So if you have that false assumption that science is the only yardstick for truth, and science can't really deal with a metaphysical notion like God, because he's not in the universe, he's not physical in the universe, therefore God doesn't exist, because science is the only yardstick for truth. And if we can't use science to try and prove this metaphysical notion, and science can't even deal with the idea of God, therefore he doesn't exist. And that's the kind of assumption here. The second assumption is, hold on a second guys, science works. Keyhole surgery, the iPhone, science works. Therefore, it is true. And if it's true, and science can only deal with things that you can observe, and God by definition you can't observe, therefore God doesn't exist. Yes, that's very fuzzy logic, but that's the assumption here. The third false assumption is, science leads to certainty. It leads to certainty, absolute truths. These are scientific facts. They're unchanging. It's the Moses tablets, right? You hear lots of people talk like this sometimes, especially on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and all those funny places, right? So if it leads to certainty and science cannot deal with a metaphysical notion that you can't observe like a creator, therefore God doesn't exist. Because science can only be certain about things other than God, for example. Yes, that's fuzzy logic, but that's the basis of that assumption, that false assumption. The fourth false assumption is basically people adopt philosophical naturalism and they misunderstand methodological naturalism. Now I don't want to give you a huge headache with lots of terms. I'm going to discuss that a bit later. So those are the four false assumptions. Now before I get to, before I break down those four false assumptions, let's just really understand what science is, okay? In a general, but in a basic way. So we really understand what we're talking about here. Science is not just what you observe. We have to first understand that. Observations are required for science, but science or scientific theories and conclusions are not just observations, okay? So when I see the moon, and therefore the moon exists, that's not really a scientific theory or a scientific explanation. It's just I'm mirroring my observations, okay? Science requires observations. And what science does, it reasons, right? It uses reason to understand the observations themselves. So say you have more than 5 observations, you see 5 observations about a particular phenomenon. You use now your rational faculties to make inferences or to see if there's any connections between these observations and to understand them holistically, to understand them in a comprehensive way. That's essentially science, right? And that's the beauty of science. Now, Bertrand Russell, he said in his book, Religion and Science, published by Oxford, science is the attempt to discover by means of observation and reasoning based upon it. So it's by means of observation. You have observation, direct and indirect observation, and you reason over those observations. And he continues to basically discover particular facts about the world and the laws connecting facts with one another. So that's essentially what science is. Yes, there's much more to it than that. The method is a very interesting method, and there are debates amongst the philosophers of science concerning its method. For example, if you're a Popperian, Karl Popper, you might, want to adopt falsification, but if you're a soft Popperian, you'd be like, it's useful, but falsified theories can change if you change the assumptions. You can revive falsified theories if you change the assumptions. There's big debates about these things, but let's put them to the side. The point is, you require observations, and you require a rational mind, a human intellect, to understand those observations. That, in essence, is science, okay? So, now we've got that out of the way, let's go to the first false assumption. Because what we're dealing with here now, we're basically saying, well, science doesn't lead to atheism, and the assertion that people express that science does lead to atheism is based on four false assumptions. The first false assumption is, science is the only yardstick for truth. Now, the first problem with the first false assumption is it's self-defeating. If I say to you guys, science is the only yardstick for truth, and that statement itself has to be true, then I would just basically say to you, can you prove that statement scientifically? No, it's self-defeating. That's the first point. We can all go home now. Let's get our pizza, right? So it's self-defeating. It's almost like saying there are no sentences in the English language longer than 3 words. But I've just uttered a sentence that's longer than 3 words, okay? Now, that's the first point. The second point I want to mention is, well, science is not the only yardstick for truth. Why? Because our observations are always going to be limited. And truth will always change from that point of view. And that's one of the beauties of science. Now, the atheist and the philosopher of science and the philosopher of biology, Professor Elliot Sober, he basically says in his essay called Empiricism that at any moment in time, scientists are limited to the observations they have at hand. Now, just think of it, just use your intellect here. It's so obvious that you may have another observation that can contradict your previous conclusions based upon your previous limited observations. So therefore, truth can change in science, which is one of the beauties of science. Truth can change. What we consider to be true can change. So science is limited to what it can observe. And not only can its truth claims change, but its scope and its area of focus is limited. Therefore, it can't answer other questions. Because there are many things that you can't observe directly or indirectly, but yet we believe them to be true. For example, necessary logical truths. You can't observe necessary logical connections or necessary logical links between logical properties in deductive logic. I know that sounds really crazy. I'm going to explain it later, okay? But you can't observe that. And by the way, you have to have that before you do science. So it's limited to observation. The third point, science is morally neutral. Or in other words, it's amoral. Now, what do I mean by this? I don't mean scientists are immoral. Of course not. God forbid, right? What I'm saying here is, although scientists are human beings too, and sometimes we have a culture we think just because he's a scientist, he's like, the religion of the white coats, right? We have that kind of assumption sometimes in popular discourse, right? Anyway, so science is morally neutral. What do I mean by this? Well, there are many things that we take to be first principles in moral theory, in metaethics. Meaning that there are some things that we consider to be objectively morally true. There are objective moral values in the world. There are objective moral truths. Not all of them, but I'm a true believer that we all believe in objective moral truths, regardless of what society tells us, regardless of what individual minds tell us, and regardless of what our intuitions or our psychological, our emotions tell us, right? So let me give you an example. You go home, you're tired from work or university, and you turn on the television, and you see breaking news. And the headline says, man beheads 5-year-old. Now, that's morally wrong, right? Yes? Yes? No? Okay. All right, let's assume you all said no, right? An emphatic no. Of course. So, we said yes, rather. What was my question? I'm going to get myself in trouble. It's morally wrong, correct? Good. Now, next question. Is it objectively morally wrong? For example, if the whole world were to come and say to you, it's okay to behead a 5-year-old, it'd still be morally wrong. And if individual minds, right, and individual human beings with their own emotional disposition came to you and said, no, let me justify it to you intellectually and emotionally, you'd be like, no, it's still morally wrong. This is what we mean by objective. It's outside of the limited human mind in a way, outside of limited emotions, and therefore it requires some kind of grounding. What explains and takes into account the objectivity of that moral value and where did it come from? If we consider some morals to be objective in this sense, science has no say. Science is asleep. It has no say in this issue. Why? Because science can't provide a rational basis for the objectivity of moral values, for objective moral truths and values. Why? Well, let's remind ourselves what Charles Darwin said. He gave an extreme example concerning this notion. He basically said, if we were to be reared under precisely the same conditions as the hive bees, we would think it's okay to kill our brothers and okay to kill our fertile daughters. Now, if you extend that logic and you talk about the nurse shark, you know, one would argue that if we were reared under precisely the same biological conditions as the nurse shark, we would think it's okay to rape women. That's what the nurse shark does. Check the National Geographic. The nurse shark bites the fin of its mate and wrestles its mate, which is tantamount, equivalent to forced mating, rape, right? So there is a problem here because all the Darwinian mechanism can do, or to be a bit more specific, all that natural selection can do is provide us with the ability to formulate ethical rules. We agree with this. It gives you the ability to formulate ethical rules, but it doesn't give you a foundation to justify or take into account objective moral truths. Why? Because these morals are subject, not objective anymore, they're subject to inevitable biological changes. Not only that, morals lose any meaning under biology. They lose meaning because it's just almost arbitrary. It's like a result of an accidental rearing of certain biological conditions. That's why science is amoral from this perspective, or morally neutral from this perspective.